Let's create some Windows Forms app in C#. So in Visual Studio, we'll create a new project. I'll right-click on the solution and add new project. And that new project will be a Windows Form app. And there you see what I get for free. I get a Windows form that has a title or a caption, which is a text property, and then some Windows controls, and the client area, which at this point is blank, and that's where I'm going to eventually put my Windows controls. So let's start off by making this the startup project and running it. And now we can say F5 or just click on the Start button instead of Control F5 because we don't have to worry about losing the console window because now there isn't one. So there's my Windows Form application. Again, it's got a title and some Windows controls and a blank client area. So let me go ahead and close that. And let's take a look in Visual Studio about what's actually been created. So what I have here is a file called form1.cs, and inside of that there's actually an additional file, form1designer.cs. This is the file that's created for us by Visual Studio, and we can look at this code, and sometimes it's nice to be able to look at it and get ideas or see examples of things, but we don't want to modify it because Visual Studio has control of that and can easily overwrite our modifications. In addition to the form1 file, we also have the program file. Let's take a look at that. So it's very simple. We don't typically add to the program class with Windows applications. As you can see, it's creating a new instance of the form1 class and executing that as a parameter to application.run. So form1 is our first opportunity to see what's known as a partial class. In other words, the rest of this class code is someplace else. And specifically where it is in the designer file. So this is the other part of that partial class. So that class is split up into two files. The file that we modify, or otherwise affect, is called form1.cs. And I want you to notice that it is just a class. There's nothing particularly special about it. It's a class. It happens to be called form1. It gets some of its information from another class called form using derivation, which we'll talk about in another lecture. And notice that I have a using directive for System Windows Forms. So a lot of the resources for this section will be coming out of that namespace, System Windows Forms, which is also in an assembly called System Windows Forms. All right, so let's go back to Design. And I'm going to go to Toolbox. Now, if the Toolbox pane is not available, you can always go to View, Toolbox. I will bring this up, and I'm just going to go to All Windows Controls. And here we see a window control called a button. And I have two options. I can either double click on this and it will appear in my form, or I can click and drag onto my form. And there you see the new control, in this case called button 1. And what I want to do is I want to affect the properties associated with that button. So I'm going to go to the Properties pane. I'm going to right-click on the button and select Properties. As you see, here it is, and there's the name in code, button 1, and then the class of that button, in this case, button. The first thing you want to do is you want to modify one of the properties associated with the control, and that property is called name. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to not modify that at first so that we can see what happens if you neglect to do that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some code to this button. In other words, I'm going to add an event procedure. I'm going to go back to the button, and I'm going to double click on it. And it creates a stub. That's the event procedure for my button when it fires a click event. So when somebody clicks on the button, this will be fired. So this, again, you'll see that I'm in form1.cs. In other words, this is part of the code that I can modify. Let's take a look at what happened at the designer file as a result of creating that event procedure and control. And back in the designer file, we can open up this region called Windows Form Designer Generated Code, and we will see that now there is a field called button 1, and it's being instantiated with a button. In other words, an object of class button is being instantiated and assigned to my field called button1. And you can see that field down here. So in other words, a Windows control is, again, nothing magical, just the same sort of stuff we've been working with. A Windows control is a field. It just happens to be of a class that has a visible aspect, in this case button1. As the application runs, that field will be modified in various ways, and you can see some of that modification here. So this is sort of a nice example of some of the code that you could use to modify your own controls at runtime should you choose to. Of course, we don't want to modify here because Visual Studio has control over this file, but we can do any of the same sort of stuff that we see here inside of our own code. In this case, all I'm going to do is I'm going to add an event procedure or a code to the event procedure for button1 click. So we'll do something simple. So now that event procedure, or that is to say this code, will execute at runtime when I click on the button. So I'm going to start the program and click on the button. And there we see the event procedure executing, which causes the message box to appear with the appropriate message. All right. So now notice the name of the event procedure. The name of the event procedure takes its name from the name of the field. And again, that field is button1. We can go back to the designer. We can see that field. It's right here. The name of that field is button1. And the name of the event is click. So what Visual Studio does when you create a new event procedure for controls, it takes the name of the control plus an underscore plus the name of the event. So let's just say that at this point we've realized we want to change the name of that field. There's a couple of ways that you can do that. You could go back to Design, right-click on the button, select Properties, and then go to the name property associated with that particular control. And the way I'm going to name the controls, I'm going to leave the class name in the name of the field and then give it some descriptive name like hello. Now this does not affect the visible aspect of that button. It still looks exactly the same. As you can see it still says button1. I want to affect the visual aspect of the button, in this case the text property. You go down to the text property and change that to be something appropriate to whatever the button does. Like so. And then we run the code. And everything's good. And it executes the event procedure. Now let's go back to the code. And you'll see that the name of the event procedure is still button1 underscore click, even though the name of the button has changed. So in other words, we created an event procedure before renaming our button, and we're sort of stuck with this name because it was created before that name change. So then you say, well, I want to make sure that my event procedures are named appropriately. In other words, the name of the control underscore plus the name of the event. Now in this case, the name of the control is no longer button1, but instead the name of the control is button hello. So we'll go back to our code and we'll say, well, I wanted this to be consistent, so I'll change this name like so. And then go back to Design, and you see that what we've done is we've completely broken the application at this point. It doesn't know what to do because the name no longer matches, and it can't find the event procedure that it thinks is supposed to be associated with that button. So essentially what I'm showing you here is what not to do, because it's fairly easy to do this by accident as you're first creating your Windows applications, and this can be kind of frustrating. So I'm going to go back to Form 1, and I'm going to change the name back to what it's supposed to be, and then go back to Design, and as you see, I fixed the problem. So all I'm really saying is what you want to do is you want to rename your controls before you start giving them event procedures. And if you do choose to rename a control after it has an existing event procedure, you do need to be a little bit careful about changing the name of the event procedure. So instead of just typing in a new name here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and select rename, and now use the rename tool to change this to button hello. And what that'll do is make sure that it gets renamed appropriately in all places where it needs to be renamed. Now that would have been another way I could have fixed this problem. I could have just looked for all the places where button 1 existed and changed it to button hello or vice versa. In any case, now the program works as we want it to. So essentially, I just made the mistake for you so you don't have to make it yourself. As I showed you, there is a way out of it if you do inadvertently change the name after a control has event procedures. However, you'd be best off to just create the control and name it as a first step and then give it event procedures. All right, let's go back to our design and let's add to this, let's say, another control, and let's make that a text box. So again, I find text box in the toolbox, double click, and that appears as you see here. And that's going to allow me to type things in. And so once again, the first step is always to change the name of the control. And let's call this one name. And then to show you what it does, let's go ahead and run the code. And now we can type things into that text box. Of course, it doesn't do anything else, but it does accept text. So that's our first step. Now we want to label that text box so we can tell the user what's supposed to go in it. And it turns out that that's literally called label. So there's a control here called label, and I can drag that onto my form. And there you see it. And I will line that up with the text box. And once again, the first step is to give that a name. So I'll call that label name. And I will change its text property. You'll notice this check property is still label 1 because the name property is the name of the field. The text property is how it shows up on the form. So I will change it from label 1 to name. And then you can see that reflected back on the form itself. So now let's add an additional button that allows us to accept that name. So again, I go to the properties dialog and I change the name property. And by the way, notice that in the properties dialog, I can display properties alphabetically or by category. And so I'll just change that. And you can see that there's a data category and a behavior category and an appearance and whatnot. I tend to like the alphabetical approach, but you might like the category approach to displaying property names. All right, so for this button, I'm going to change its name to button OK. And of course, that changes the name of the property. But we'll also want to change the text. So the text property will also be OK. And once that change is accepted, you can see how that affects the button. So now what I'd like to do is I would like to display whatever the user types in as part of a message. So I will add an additional label. And for this, I will change its name property. Again, first step. I'll call this label message. And I will change its text to be blank, so there is no text. So once that's accepted, you'll see that the label actually disappears from the form. I'm going to go back by selecting from this drop-down, label message. And I'm going to change the property border style, and you see there's a drop-down here, and I can select that. And I'm going to say fixed 3D. And we will actually see that change at runtime. In the meantime, let's add an event procedure to the OK button. Again, remember the easiest way to add an event procedure is to double-click on the control, and it will create the default event. Now, we've done that already with the Say Hello button. I double-clicked on it, and it created a click event. For the OK button, let's do the other approach. And for that, we go to the Properties pane, and you'll note that next to Properties, there's a lightning bolt, and that is for events. I'll click on that, and now these are all the events associated with that control. And of course I can pick any of them, but I'm going to pick click. There you see click, and if you just double click on that, it will create a stub, or if the event procedure already exists, it will navigate in code to that stub. So I'm going to double click here. And there's my stub for the OK button. And for this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the text property of label message to be equal to the message hello there plus text box names text property, so that you can see all of the controls on the form recognize one another. And again, these are just fields placed on the form, and we can see that by going to the designer view, and there are all of the controls that I've placed on this particular form. So back to design, and now I'm going to run the code and type in a name and click OK, and you see that that name appears here in that label. So in that way, the controls on your form can interact together. So let's run this again. What I want you to notice is that there is a blue outline around the Say Hello button. It's actually tab stop number 1. In other words, if you hit the tab key, it will change input focus from Say Hello to the text box to the OK button, and then back to Say Hello. And we can see the property for that. So I go back, close this, and go back, go to the Properties pane, and select Button Hello. And you'll note that right now we're in the event area, so I'm going to go back to Properties, and I'm going to look at tab stop, that's set to true, and tab index, which is set to 0. In other words, what these two properties together say is that you can use the tab key to change input focus on the controls on your form, and the first one, tab index 0, will be, in this case, button hello. And if we go and we look at, say, button OK, we will find that that tab stop is also set to true, and its tab index is 3. So 0, 1, 2, 3. The label cannot accept input focus, so it does not have a tab stop. So if I wanted to change the order in which the tab control changes input focus, I can do that very easily. Again, you have to go to a control that can accept input focus, like hello, and simply change this number. Or if you don't want it in the cycle at all, you can change tab stop true to be tab stop false. Notice that here, again, there's a drop down to select true or false. But something like this, a Boolean, if you just double click on it, it will toggle the values. So let's say that what you wanted was when the user hits enter or clicks on the OK button, that the same thing happens. In other words, you want this control to be tied to the enter key for this particular form. This is actually a property not of any particular control, but of the form itself. So if we go back to properties, and as you can see, we can actually select form 1 here. So the whole form is nothing but a control. And as we said before, first thing you should do is change your name property. So I'll call this form Say Hello. And if I choose, I can also change the text property, which is the caption of the form. And once that change is accepted, you can see that it changes the caption of the form itself. But what I really want to do is change the accept button property. So you can see that right now accept button is none. If I hit the drop down, you can see all the things that accept button could be. And in this case, I want it to be button OK. And now when you run the code and type something into the name text box, and then hit enter rather than clicking on the OK button, it does the same thing as click on the OK button, because the OK button for this form is now set to be the accept button. So that's the end of our first discussion of Windows Forms applications.